Welcome, everyone. This presentation is hosted by Division 47, the Society for Sport, Exercise, and Performance Psychology. My name is Ryan Sappington, and I'm one of two student representatives for Division 47, along with Maria Galante. And on behalf of the division, we'd like to welcome you all to today's event. We're excited and grateful to be hosting this webinar and for the contributions of our panel. We have three presenters today, and we're going to leave approximately 15 minutes at the end for a question and answer and discussion session. As questions come up during the presentation, feel free to send them in using your webinar control panel. Finally, Division 47 is going to be live tweeting during the event. If you're on social media during or after the webinar, please use #PerformancePsych. We're fortunate to have an amazing panel of speakers and a moderator agree to take part in today's event. The presenters today include Dr. Sari Shepard, Dr. Charlie Brown, and Dr. Gloria Park. Sari is a licensed psychologist, author, consultant, and educator. She's the founder of Sport and Perform Consulting, through which she offers performance and clinical psychology services. Charlie is the director of Get Your Head in the Game and has served as a resource for Olympic teams and the Charlotte Ballet, and served as content expert for developing a mental skills curriculum for surgeons. Gloria is the Senior Performance Psychology Scientist with the Consortium for Health and Military Performance, where she translates research on performance optimization for service members and their families. Our moderator and discussant for today's webinar is Dr. K.E.Y.S. Kate practices sport, performance, and clinical psychology in Toronto, Canada, working with athletes and performing artists, and Kate is a past president of Division 47. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Sari.
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you to APA Division 47 for the invitation. I am really pleased to be with you today. I will be talking briefly today about keys to effective practice when working with performers from domains outside of sport. So what does that involve? And how can we be effective in our work as performance consultants? In dialoguing with both students and professionals who have been exposed to training in sports psychology, it has been conveyed to me that there is a sense in which performance psychology in domains outside of sport remains a mystery. Or if you're old enough to remember a short-lived local campaign surrounding a very well-known chocolate candy and a play on Winston Churchill's words describing something extraordinarily complex, it seems to be an enigma wrapped in a riddle shrouded in a mystery. So what is the secret or the magic behind performance psychology? My 6-year-old the other day was peeking under the lid of a portable DVD player, very intently watching the spindle that holds the disc rotate and spin as she pressed play and stop and play again, then closing and opening the lid to see what was happening. When I asked her what she was doing, she said very excitedly, "I'm looking under the hood to see how this works." So today we'll take a peek under the hood, under the canopy that seems to exist for some when it comes to apprehending the practical work involved in performance psychology. And we'll be starting with some definitions. Psychology of performance addresses the ways in which performers think, feel, and behave so as to obtain optimal results in their particular domain. And the task is to assist the development of more effective or optimal performance within a particular domain. And again, for today, we'll be talking about domains outside of sport. And so effective practice in performance psychology, what does that involve? What are keys to effective practice in performance psychology? Well, we have an acronym that we'll be using today, K.E.Y.S, for our purposes today, K.E.Y.S for effective practice in performance psychology. And this will also help us to organize a lot of information in our very short time together. So K.E.Y.S to effective practice in performance psychology will be knowledge of the performance domain, effective conceptualization, a yardstick of applied research, and specific application to the specific consulting situation. And we'll be starting with key number 1, knowledge of and consideration for whatever unique performance domain we may be addressing. And so what kind of knowledge will be of benefit? Well, first, an understanding of the demands of that unique domain. This will allow me as the consultant to communicate more effectively with my client. So, for example, what are the demands of being a dancer? What are the demands of being a business executive in the client's unique profession? What are the demands or the expectations associated with being a trial attorney? Each time I work with a unique performance domain, I do some background research to equip my understanding of the domain in which my client performs in order to better equip my work. And of course, some of that information I yield directly from talking with my client. And let me add here that a lack of firsthand knowledge does not preclude effective work. I have worked with performance domains as wide-ranging as rodeo performers to stand-up comedians to fashion models. I have never been a search and rescue first responder or an emergency facial recognition reconstruction surgeon or a calf wrangler. I have never ridden a bull or been a stand-up comedian, but I have done effective work with my clients from these domains by addressing this first key to effective practice. I try to gain a contextual intelligence, a practical knowledge of the context within which my client performs and works in order to better understand their real-world demands. And again, this allows for a common language with which to interact with my client. And if you have not yet read it, I would highly recommend the article on contextual intelligence by Brown, Gould, and Foster referenced here. And you can find the complete reference in the reference slides that will be at the close of the webinar. And so next, what is some of the domain-specific information that helps me to speak that common language and gain that contextual intelligence? In addition to and as a part of the context of my client's experience, I will want to know something of the performance culture that exists within their domain. The culture of performance, well, today we will see the culture of performance for a surgeon. It's certainly different than that of a soldier. There is a culture and there are cultural expectations and performance expectations that very much impact the experience of each unique performer. For example, the culture of a popular singer may be very different than that of a classical or operatic singer. I want to know something about that cultural impact in order to enhance my working knowledge and apply that for effective practice. I will also want to understand the nature of performance stress within the unique domain of my performance client. Again, this helps me to work effectively. If I understand better the objective and subjective stress of a first responder with whom I am working, it enhances my cultural intelligence, and that will make for effective practice. This is part of the domain-specific information that is very useful to me as a consultant. For example, the perceived performance-related stress of a chamber musician is very different than that of a music industry executive, but my understanding of each helps me to be more effective as a performance consultant. And then related to performance stress are performance expectations, which again will be unique across performance domains. For example, the performance expectations for a member of the clergy who stands before hundreds or thousands of people each week with a prepared work will be very distinct from, say, a stand-up comedian who stands before hundreds or thousands of people each week with a prepared work. Understanding these varying expectations makes for more effective practice. And even within these domains, I should say even within domains that are more closely related, for example, the performance expectations of a classical prima ballerina may indeed be very different than that of a member of a modern dance troupe. But this is domain-specific information that will make for more effective work. Also important is how performers within a particular domain work together and relate to each other. And again, this can be very domain-specific. For example, courtroom attorneys forge very different relationships with each other than do first responders. Those relationships are part of the culture and the context for a performer that can be very helpful to understand because these relationships impact expectations and stress and context. And lastly on this first key, although I would really encourage you to go to Hayes and Brown for a more complete discussion of domain-specific information, another domain-specific piece of information impacting my work as a performance consultant are the expectations that a client may have for performance consulting. And that includes whether or not performance consulting is an accepted part of the culture of that particular domain, or if it remains more taboo. Actors, for example, are very familiar with the concept of performance coaching, and so this kind of work is almost a natural complement to what an actor may be familiar with. But that may be very different from the expectations of a composer whose culture is much more internal and private, for example. But all of this informs our work. This is domain-specific information that impacts a performer's culture and context, and knowledge of that helps me to speak my client's language, or to use a phrase that we are perhaps very familiar with, to meet my clients where they are. And this enhances cultural, contextual intelligence and makes for more effective practice. And so this kind of unique knowledge is our first key to effective practice. And that leads us to the second key, effective case conceptualization. And of course, this is true for the work of any consultant. You'll need a clear understanding of the referral question. What does the client want to accomplish? What are their needs and goals for change or improvement? And how can you establish effective goals for change together? Well, first you'll need to listen effectively, and second you'll need to question effectively. What constitutes a good performance, or success, or excellence, or demands, or performance anxiety for your client or clients? I will need to listen effectively, and I will need to question effectively. The needs, for example, for a classical singer may be very different than that of a popular singer. The presenting issue for a senior executive may be vastly different than for that of a composer. So I will listen effectively and I will question effectively in order to proceed effectively in my work as a performance consultant. And I have some suggestions here that you may choose to refer to later, such as the Sport Clinical Intake Protocol from Taylor and Schneider, that you can adapt to performance from other domains. And I've also included a list of questions that I personally ask every performer initially when I meet with them. You may want to take a screenshot of this while it's up for the moment. And if you can't see it well, then please feel free to email me. My contact information will be at the end of my presentation. But these are questions that I'll ask every client. For example, what is it that drew my client to this unique performance domain? Why have they chosen that domain? What are some of the performance barriers that they can identify? And what do those problems mean to the performer? How have they attempted to address it? Of course, that's something I'll want to know, is what they've tried so far. I'll also ask about their goals for performance and their expectations for themselves. And I ask each performer with whom I work to try to describe one of their best performances to me, as well as what they would consider to be one of their worst performances. These are questions that help me to attend to effective listening and effective questioning, and they help me to attend to our first key for effective performance, which is gaining a knowledge of their performance domain, and then to the second key, which is effective case conceptualization. But then what? And that leads me to key number 3, which is the available yardstick of applicable research, where our training converges and brings divergent performance domains to a common core. We have decades of applied research that has yielded an understanding of skills that are involved in optimizing performance. We have studies and applied examples of the benefits of CBT interventions, solution-focused therapy, positive psychology and learning theory, and their application for behavior change. And so if we take a look under the hood, under the canopy of performance psychology, that is a lot of what we will find. It's not a mystery. In domains outside of sport, we benefit from this yardstick. Those coming to performance psychology will benefit from an understanding of the research and knowledge of applied sports psychology, the research and knowledge pertaining to behavior change, for example, from the cognitive sciences, learning theory, social sciences, and these may be skills that you may already apply if you practice psychotherapy. We will benefit from an understanding of research and knowledge of consulting and coaching relationships. And other key points found along this yardstick would be the Big 5 canon of psychological skills, as referred to by Anderson, and which come from CBT and the areas that I identified in the slide prior. For example, of the Big 5, we have intensity management, arousal regulation, self-talk, which we could also refer to as cognitive restructuring, if that's our theoretical orientation, imagery, concentration and attention, goal setting, and of course these above are often synthesized into a pre-performance routine that will help promote consistency. So the same skills applied in sports psychology interventions can be applied to performance domains outside of sport. And you will hear Charlie and Gloria in case application today, and with contextual intelligence, talk about the benefit of applying these convergent skills to divergent performance populations. And then additional areas of the yardstick of applicable research that make for keys to effective practice. We will benefit from having knowledge of systemic issues and concerns. For example, systems knowledge. Family systems, which of course would be very important if we're working with an adolescent performer. Organizational systems, understanding the various organizational hierarchies and structures, for example. And group processes, which would be very helpful working with groups of performers or teams of performers. And we have the key point of understanding the biobehavioral bases of movement and exercise. For example, exercise physiology, motor learning, kinesiology. And of course, each of us has our own ethical practice guidelines. It may be that consultation may be necessary when you are addressing work in an unfamiliar performance domain. And we need to make sure, of course, that we practice within our own scope of competence. Is performance psychology a veiled mystery or an enigma wrapped in a riddle shrouded in a mystery? No, because of the yardstick of applicable research that we have, which converge to provide a foundation that is a key ingredient for effective practice. And finally, to our fourth key today in our acronym KEYS, the specific application of this foundational and contextual knowledge to our specific consulting situation. As we will see and hear today from our other presenters, in order to be effective, we cannot overlook the importance of context. Each client and/or group of clients is unique and will present with their own unique performance concerns. We cannot overlook the importance of the consulting relationship. This is something that Rogers emphasized more than a half century ago. And of course, one's own approach and personality and theoretical orientation and training lens allows for divergent application of our common principles in performance consulting. And lastly, the client's own readiness for change certainly necessitates divergent applications of our convergent knowledge. And you can see the trans-theoretical model and some references there if you would like to familiarize yourself more with the idea of readiness for change. And so we have these keys to effective practice in performance psychology. Knowledge of the performance domain, effective conceptualization of the performance concern, our yardstick of applied research, and the specific application of this research and knowledge to the specific consulting situation, which allows us as consultants to, as Bishop says, use the best available evidence at the right time, in the right environment, for the right individual to improve their performance. I have worked with very divergent performance domains, some of which you can see here. And yet, taking a look under the hood, taking a look under the canopy, it is no mystery. The same keys for practice, the same convergent keys for practice allow me to address very divergent performance concerns and to do so effectively. I'd be very happy to take some questions at the end, and please feel free to contact me with any follow-up questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Sari, thank you ever so much for a wonderful lead off to this program. And I'm delighted to be here today and to share with you what I consider to be one of the most fascinating and potentially fruitful areas of performance consulting today. And it's talking about the neurology of performance. And my objective, I want to provide you a framework for understanding the neurology of performance and specifically to learn to match interventions with a neurological process that is optimal for task in the specific stage of performance. Now, as Sari mentioned, context is important in everything. And so a bit of the context from which I work, I have been in full-time practice independently consulting in performance only since 2004, and actually I retired last year, so it's a blast doing this program. My model is Nidafer's attentional model of performance, which has 3 key elements. You have to, first of all, once you set your goal, you have to know what is essential for success, and then you simply have to maintain attention on the essential, and thirdly, ignore distractions. The other aspect that is central to my practice is contextual intelligence. I believe that contextual intelligence and designing contextual intelligence interventions is the essential for any effective practice. And in 2013, I was invited to be the content director for a program where we're developing a mental skills curriculum for surgeons that was based upon the mental skills training models and programs that were being used at the USOC and in the Army's Human Performance Laboratories. And the key for success for any intervention from a contextual intelligence perspective is that the intervention must be in the client's language and it must fit the client's reality. When I was preparing to work with the surgeons, I knew that I needed to present a framework that would fit a medical perspective, that would fit the medical language, and I knew that a lot of the knowledge and references that I talked about, such as the logical left brain, it seemed to make sense, but I also knew that it wasn't consistent with the current research. So in my studies to become more familiar with the language and the medical reality, I came upon a book that Daniel Goleman wrote in 2013. It's entitled Focus, the Hidden Driver of Excellence. Now, you may be familiar with Goleman as one of the individuals who did extensive writing on emotional intelligence. Goleman is a scientist, but what he really is great at is his writing skills. He's written for the New Yorker and the New York Times. He does a wonderful synthesis of scientific literature and translates it into user-friendly concepts. In this particular book, he took all of the functional MRI research and translated it into the role of excellence in performance. And it has clear application to performance consulting, and actually it transformed the way I worked. I went and even though I knew I was headed towards retirement, I changed all of my presentations to incorporate these concepts, and I would like to share with you the synthesis as to how I see these neurological concepts fitting into performance consulting today. Now, my disclaimer here is that I am not a neuropsychologist, and a 15-minute presentation will not make you an expert in this area. It will hopefully give you a basic idea and hopefully whet your appetite where you may explore this further to integrate it into your consulting practices. So what are we talking about when we're looking at neurology and the neurological basis of performance? In my younger days, I always refer to the logical left and reactive right. And actually, if you look at the fMRI research, that is not the case. Goleman talks about the top-down brain and the bottom-up brain. The top-down brain is the prefrontal cortex. This is that amazing area that gives us, it's the center of reason, it's the center of all of our thinking, our ability to think abstractly, conceptualize future and past. This is the part of the brain that separates us from all the other animals in the universe. The challenge with this part of the brain, as wonderful as it is neurologically slow. it requires a high level of energy, and it's really easily fatigued. It's when, if you're trying to grasp something and you know when you're just mentally exhausted, that's usually the part of the brain that you've been working with. And in terms of neurologically slow, as an example, if I were to show you a video, and most videos run at the rate of 60 frames per second. And if on this video there were 59 blank frames, and then on the 60th frame I have an image of a snake. If you were looking at the screen right now, and you would see, if I said, what are you seeing? You're seeing a white screen. However, your heart would start elevating, heart start beating faster, your palms may start sweating a little bit, and you may start breathing a little bit more rapidly and a little bit more shallow. But that top-down brain, if I say what's going on, you would be able to tell me about all the physiological changes, but you would still say, I don't understand it. I'm just looking at a blank screen. That's because your bottom-up brain has recognized the image of a snake and will trigger an appropriate response to the perceived danger. Now, when we're talking about the bottom-up brain, that's the subcortical neural areas, the basal ganglia and the amygdala. This is the area that is neurologically fast, it is always on, and it uses much, much less energy. And this is the part of the brain that deals with habits and routines. It is highly responsive to emotions and also highly susceptible to primitive instincts. Now, if we're looking at, okay, which is the most important, the top down or the bottom up? Optimal performance requires both the top down and the bottom up brain. The top down brain is used for intentional learning, deliberate practice to develop automated responses. You use that top-down brain to have routines that are integrated with triggers and cues. You use it to manage impulses, and also during those mindful cognitive decision choice points during a performance. The bottom-up brain, however, that's the part of the brain that controls rapid, fluid execution of motor tasks. That's the part that, if you think about Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, it deals with pattern recognition. It also is the area of the brain that's used to manage energy and attention during long performances, or in the case of surgeons, long medical procedures. The implications for the two different parts of the brain are really, in my mind, tremendous. If you look at the 7 key mental skills that most of the research will show, these are the common skills that we use when attempting to improve performance. And if you pair the skills with the neurological processes, you'll see that that top-down brain is involved with goal setting, developing the performance plan, pre-performance routine, and developing initial refocusing strategies. The bottom-up brain is all about activation management, attention, thought management, imagery, and mental rehearsal. Part of that top-down brain, the focus, is actually to design and then overlearn the routines to make that pre-performance routine and refocusing strategy actually become a bottom-up neurological process. The distinction between the top-down and bottom-up is really important because the way that you influence the two different parts of the brain are totally different. The top-down brain is the world of language. It can be either external talk or internal talk, thinking, or symbols. Yeah, that's the world of the top-down brain. The bottom-up brain, however, is the realm of images, rhythms, emotions, and kinesthetic sensations. You know, thinking is one of the most common distractions to peak performance that I've always hear in my consulting work. And that is specifically a case where the bottom-up brain needs to be the one that's leading and most focused, but the thinking internal language is the bottom-up brain attempting to control or intervene when it's a bottom-up brain that's called for. Now, how do you deal with these concepts in an applied setting? One of the first things that, well, first of all, I should say, seasoned performers get this distinction. The buy-in is actually very, very easy, particularly if you have high-level performers. When I'm dealing with performers of all levels, I like to have exercises and examples. I encourage you to develop your own exercises and examples that demonstrate the difference between the two processes. For example, I like to use the image of the rabbit and the duck that you see over in the right. I usually have this on a screen where I can rotate it and say, which do you want to see? Depending upon where you focus your attention will determine what you see. It doesn't require thinking. It's all about attention and focus. If you focus your attention in the front area, you'll see a rabbit. If you focus your attention at the top area, you'll see a duck, and the performer will quack up. Once the person differentiates between the two processes, I always do as Sarah suggested, you identify what processes are associated with a client's peak performance and worst performance. There again, buy-in is usually very easy with this. Now, the top-down processes should be addressed early in the training process. You use language, words, and symbols where you want to identify not so much specific goal, but the target. Where does the individual want to place his or her attention? You want to develop strategies for anticipated choice points and distractions, and then to develop deliberate practice techniques to really begin integrating automated processes. And I strongly encourage you to develop routines that have triggers and cues to automate the response. When you're attempting to intervene and influence the bottom-up processes, there's a paradox because you cannot verbally teach the bottom-up processes any more than you can verbally teach a person to ride a bicycle. When I'm working with clients and we move to the realm of the bottom-up processes, I openly acknowledge the inefficiency of words. You then can coach experientially by using metaphors, analogies, and experiential exercises. It's really important during all those exercises to attempt to integrate triggers and cues to automate the processes. And many people do rapid relaxation techniques. One of the things that I've found most helpful is to make certain that the rapid relaxation techniques include focus where the individual is actively engaging that bottom-up brain. That's what we see in all the mindfulness techniques. That's where the majority of techniques that we use in performance consulting are, in my opinion, helping people become more mindful, intentional, and comfortable engaging that bottom-up brain. Now, this is an area that is fertile, and I really hope that people will take this idea and run with it, and I welcome answering any questions that you have during the discussion period.
All right, Thank you so much, Charlie. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us and staying with us at the end of this webinar. My name is Gloria Park, and I hope to round out what Sari and Charlie have already presented by sharing with you a framework of performance optimization applied to a very specific population, the operational and tactical populations in the military and beyond. And in that process, share a few best practices and lessons learned, as well as raise a few important questions about how to advance the science and application of performance psychology in this domain. So here's our standard government disclaimer. The opinions expressed here are my own today. So let's begin by setting the stage by understanding some of the specifics of this population. So warfighters, as defined here, are the many men and women who, whether they wear uniforms or do not, are working within our government and affiliated agencies to defend this threat, defend this nation against ongoing threats. So some of their vulnerabilities include exposure to a broad spectrum of chronic and acute stressors, excessive physical wear and tear that comes with intensive training, social stressors like frequent moves and separations from family and loved ones, increased risk for exposure to trauma, as well as other occupation-specific risks, which we will discuss as we get further along in this presentation. However, this population has lots of vulnerabilities, but also has many unique assets that make them an ideal population for performance psychology intervention. So some of these assets include being inherently a strength-focused culture. If you examine some of the creeds and mottos that are associated with uniformed services, you'll find that their culture is inherently focused on strengths. They are incredibly resilient. So if you think of resilience as something that is born of facing challenges and adversity, then this group is some of the most resilient folks that you'll ever have the pleasure of working with. Their performances are strongly tied to their identities, so they're always looking for ways to stay ahead of the curve. And this makes them really open and amenable to learning about performance strategies. And finally, they have a very strong sense of meaning and purpose in the work that they do. And they also have a sense of shared community and identity with those who share the jobs with them. And as we go through this presentation, we'll tie back to some of these strengths and vulnerabilities as we talk more specifically about best practices. So in this domain, psychology practitioners play a number of different roles. Licensed clinicians focus mostly on identifying and relieving pathology, like PTSD and depression, but also work on quality of life issues to promote health and healing. Research psychologists at organizations like RARE and other places seek to gain empirical understanding of issues that matter most to service members and their families. Operational psychologists are typically embedded assets at schoolhouses or within units. They are specific assets that help with selection, recruitment, and assessment, and they focus more on organizational level factors than they do on individual level development. And then there are the sport and performance psychology practitioners and educators. So currently, the Department of Defense is the #1 employer of sport and performance psychology practitioners and educators in the country. And the demand for psychology professionals and educators continues to grow as programs and organizations like the Army Ready and Resilient program, as well as the USOCOM Preservation of the Force and Family programs, look for ways to enhance performance and well-being in their service members. So my organization, which is the Consortium for Health and Military Performance, works to bridge the gap between the academic and research community and the medical and warfighter community. So in 2012, we were designated a Center of Excellence for Health and Military Performance, and we work to translate and apply science to support performance and well-being in warfighters and their families. Our mission is to be the premier Department of Defense translational resource in the complete range of disciplines associated with military unique human performance optimization and total force fitness efforts. And all of this is centered around maximizing warfighter readiness and performance and optimizing the resilience of the global military family. So as it continues to evolve, CHAMP hopes to become an asset for the entire U.S. national security community. So in this presentation, I will share with you several best practices that we've learned, having unique visibility of the various efforts ongoing across the Department of Defense. And I'll bridge some of these best practices to efforts currently being executed at CHAMP, as well as raising questions for all of us to consider. So the first best practice centers around viewing performance through a holistic lens. So performance psychology professionals must view performance through a holistic lens and understand that psychological performance is inextricably tied to other domains of performance. So what does holistic performance look like, or what does a holistic approach look like? So on the left, you'll see the model of total force fitness, or abbreviated as TFF. TFF tells us that performance optimization is reached through considering a warfighter's health and well-being in 8 distinct and interrelated domains. So you'll see on your screen that these domains are medical and dental, environmental, physical, social, behavioral, psychological, nutritional, and spiritual. Service members need to be supported in each of these domains, and when they experience a state of fitness or readiness in each, then they can fully engage and be ready to meet the demands of their role as part of the armed forces. This holistic approach seeks to enhance health, well-being, and performance of warfighters and their families, and also identifies the components of the desired end state, a culture that optimizes recruitment, retention, readiness, and resilience of the entire military community across these 8 domains. So what does TFF look like once it's in context? So on the right-hand side of the screen, you see a model that depicts what human performance optimization looks like. And human performance optimization, also known as HPO, is the process of applying the knowledge, skills, and emerging technologies to improve and preserve the capabilities of military members. And Admiral Mullen identified 3 of the primary goals of preserving capabilities through this total force fitness and human performance optimization model. And those 3 goals are: 1, to adapt to the chaos and complexity of the battlefield; 2, maintain vigilance in the peace; and 3, coexist peacefully in civil society. So when you think of the complexity of a warfighter's life, it's critical to view performance optimization through a holistic lens. So the key here is figuring out how these domains interact with each other, and understanding that it's not enough to support performance efforts in these domains in silos, but also addressing their interactions. And in doing so, as practitioners, we can raise the bar. So looking at performance through a holistic lens offers more insight into opportunities and pathways to help our service members and their families. So here's, as a concrete example, understanding how nutrition, sleep, and physical fitness habits impact performance for better or for worse can help us to identify a variety of solutions to performance issues that we might encounter in our practice. And understanding the spiritual orientation of an individual can inform how we can think about how motivation, meaning, and purpose drive their behavior. In addition to taking a holistic perspective, it's important to consider how to preserve the unique capabilities of each warfighter community. So Sari already spoke to this a lot in her presentation, so I won't belabor the point, but we know that performance contexts differ. So there's differences in what a football player needs in terms of performance enhancement than what a baseball player needs. And even within those disciplines, there are different performance demands between, say, a quarterback and a tight end. In the military, performance contexts for each of the branches differ, and even within each branch, unique communities face very distinct demands. So it's important to consider what the specific demands are for a particular population to better customize approaches to enhancing performance, and also primarily to help prioritize training efforts. So currently, across the Department of Defense, there's now an emphasis on reducing the training footprint. So service members are required to do a lot of mandatory training, and they're trying to figure out how to reduce the amount of training that is required to get them ready to be able to execute their tasks successfully. So understanding the unique needs of each warfighter community can help to better inform decisions about where to start with human performance optimization efforts. So at CHAMP, we attempt to do this by connecting performance optimization efforts to what we call mission essential task lists, or medals, and knowledge, skills, and abilities, or KSAs. Medals and KSAs are set forth by each subpopulation, and these mission essential task lists and knowledge, skills, and abilities create unique demand signals and provide an opportunity for us to create targeted efforts to mitigate risk and build strengths of a specific population. If you're interested in reading more about some of the factors to consider in developing precision performance, there is a research article citation by Russell and Doyster that will be in the reference section at the end of this presentation. So considering individual differences in social and environmental context are key to developing effective approaches for human performance optimization intervention. And in addition to what Sari already talked about with understanding the keys to effective practice, we also believe that understanding warfighter distinctiveness enables us to create sustainable change by building on the foundation of what the community actually needs. As Sari was talking about yardsticks, what is a yardstick for practice for the tactical athlete? Some questions were raised for me. So much of the research being applied to the military performance domains are translated currently from sports psychology. So while there are many parallels that work really well between these two populations, there are some that don't work very well. So it's critical for performance psychology practitioners to understand the differences and make efforts to know that some of what we know from sports psych doesn't translate exactly well to operational and tactical populations. So taking into account some of Sari's presentation on how do we determine what our yardstick is, I think that that's a question that we as practitioners working with this specific population could be asking. So how do we make responsible assumptions, and how do we create a need for better research to enhance practice in this specific area. Best practice number 2 is about integration. So integrating both ends of the illness performance continuum and everything in between. So creating successful outcomes is what the field of performance psychology is all about. In tactical and operational populations, it's about 2 things. It's about recognizing the brutal facts about what they do and the lives they live, while also helping to support the sureness of success. And we do this by threading the needle from left to right, which I will explain more in just a moment. So in addition to my background in sport and performance psychology, I also have a background in applied positive psychology. So I often grapple with which is the approach that's more effective for our specific population. When you think about supporting psychological fitness and performance, we have to focus on both the positive and negative dimensions of human psychology. So what you see in front of you, this very colorful graphic, depicts the illness performance continuum. So up at the top, we see the status of the warfighter, and that ranges from ill and injured all the way to healthy and optimally performing. So historically, the paradigm of the military health system is reactive. So military waits until warfighters are ill or injured before they intervene. They focus efforts on boosting resources to address problems once they've happened. And make no mistake that that is a critical piece of the overall effort to enhance performance, primarily because of the unique vulnerabilities that we already discussed at the beginning of this presentation. However, we also know that the absence of illness does not mean the presence of optimal performance, and that the presence of illness doesn't necessarily negate the possibility of optimal performance. So the future of human performance optimization depends on acknowledging and integrating efforts to enhance performance by addressing issues across the entire continuum. And as the graphic suggests, placing some of the ownership of sustaining performance on the leaders, warriors, and families themselves, and not solely in the hands of the medical community. For practitioners, it's really important to be aware of the resources and approaches that can address the entire illness performance continuum and operate within the bounds of your competency. It's also essential to be in tune to whether a performance issue is something that can be addressed just through mental skills development or something that requires the intention of a clinician. Oftentimes, when we're working with operational and tactical populations, the answer is that the operator or the warfighter can probably benefit from both. Best practice number 3 is likely what will be the most useful for our audience members out there today. If you're out there doing this work or thinking about working within this population, the best of what science has to offer won't matter one bit if you don't know your audience and understand how to engage them to create sustainable change. So again, Sari and Charlie have spoken to this already on this webinar, but the military community has language, customs, and practices all their own. And each subgroup within the military also has their own set of additional language, customs, and practices all their own. It's critical to understand what these customs are so that you could be the most impactful practitioner. So how do we do that? A number of different ways. So the military has a saying that is train like you fight and fight like you train. And what that basically means is that wars and battles are not fought in classrooms in front of PowerPoint presentations. So while those types of presentations can lay the foundation for helping to integrate performance approaches, the military believes that in order to ensure success, training must replicate scenarios that service members will actually be in with close proximity. And so contextualized learning is really key. As Charlie already said, you can't verbally teach some of the concepts that we want to have them integrate into their day-to-day tasks, which ties into the next point, that learning should be action-based. So it's easy to tell somebody about mental skills, but it's even more powerful to leverage a moment of failure or struggle to show someone what using those skills might look like. So we've worked with a number of different populations. There's one story from a Marine Corps martial arts training instructor that stands out to me. where he talks about how he uses a moment where a student has overcome a really fear-inducing task to talk and process what skills they use to push past their comfort zone in that moment. This makes learning powerful and memorable and linked closely with the tasks that they execute every day. As a practitioner, spending time with them in their specific jobs as much as possible, learning to speak their language. You can do this also by finding powerful allies in the community. So nobody has more credibility to our service members than their brothers and sisters in uniform around them. So finding folks who can be advocates alongside you is a really important part. Finally, storytelling. So storytelling is a powerful tool within the military culture. It's used effectively in leadership as well as motivational efforts. And as Charlie said as well, metaphors and analogies really help to enhance learning. So telling stories and finding those key stories that come from the military community to help illustrate your examples can make learning all that more effective. So if you're thinking about working with this group, you're up against a pretty tough challenge. This is a community that has a very strong sense of shared identity, which means in their eyes you will either belong or you won't, and you're either in or you're out. And to make your way in will take a lot of hard work. This summer I attended a presentation where MARSOC operational psychologist Dr. Carol Green summarized what being a practitioner with operational and tactical populations means in the best way that I've ever heard. And he said, quote, "Don't be too attached to your doctorness." So what that means is that you should be authentic. So these are some of the most real people you'll ever work with. There's no pretenses, and they will expect authenticity in the same way that they are being authentic with you. Take on the mindset of a learner, not an expert. So be willing to say, "I don't know, tell me more." And while you may bring the expertise in performance psychology, unless you've worn the uniform, approach with curiosity and be willing to look for opportunities to connect over appearing competent. Get in there and be willing to get your hands dirty. So working with this population is not a spectator sport. They want to know that you're there alongside them and willing to make a go at putting yourselves in their boots. And finally, I think this is a really important piece, understanding that there's still stigma. So both Sari and Charlie talked about context, and within the military there's still a lot of stigma around mental health help seeking. So knowing that you can also be part of the solution, you can be part of the solution by showing them that mental states are malleable and that help seeking doesn't necessarily have to be equated with weakness, but that it can also be equated with strength and excellence. So for those practitioners out there in the field who are looking for military-specific resources on performance, our organization has this wonderful website. There's an interdisciplinary team of us that creates evidence-based articles, resources, and tools for each of the total force fitness domains. So this is a bit of a shameless plug, but we hope that you will come to the website and see the resources that are available to you out there. And finally, some questions that are yet unanswered. So the first question, how do we build competent practitioners to work with the military? The Department of Defense continues to move towards bringing on more sports psychology practitioners, but there aren't many places to get the experience and training in that domain. So at the Consortium for Health and Military Performance, as well as USU, we're talking about how we can potentially create opportunities for practitioners to get some more experience in working with this population before they're hired or sent out to work with them to support performance psychology. The second question here is, how do we take on a lifespan perspective so that we can enhance performance as well as well-being? So we know that some of the skills taught in performance psychology can be helpful across the lifespan. So for example, teaching somebody goal setting as it relates to a specific performance can help them potentially with their transition out or in pursuing other goals that they've set for themselves beyond the military. But some practices can have unintended consequences. So for example, honing someone's nervous system to increase vigilance and response time may have an inverse effect when warfighters are in situations that don't warrant that level of hypersensitivity. So the questions that we still haven't asked is, how do we then teach people to turn off or unprogram certain training that doesn't contribute to long-term health and well-being? So these are questions that we haven't yet started asking. The third question, how do we advocate for policy level changes to emphasize performance? So the military is still a very medically minded entity, so the emphasis continues to be on illness. And so both researchers and practitioners alike need to start thinking about what kind of metrics will we have to consider to get a sense of whether efforts are successful or not. And the military defines lack of illness as ready, but we know that there is much more to the performance story than just hovering at the baseline. So what we need to all advocate for together are tools, measures, and data to start shifting that paradigm. And finally, how can we create opportunities for more cooperation and collaboration of professionals working in this sphere? So there are lots of excellent folks out there doing great work with our operational and tactical populations. In general, in the field of performance as well as sports psychology, practitioners often hold tightly to proprietary secrets, which makes sense given that competitive nature of the sport venue and that there's a lot at stake in terms of beating the other team. However, our military is literally one team, one fight. So the readiness and performance of one branch hinges on the readiness and performance of others. So we're looking at ways at CHAMP and at USU to think about how to create opportunities to share best practices and lessons learned so that we can really advance the level of engagement that this field has currently. We're scheduling a working group in the spring, and if any of you on the call are already working with this population, please contact me if you're interested in joining. And here's my contact information. And there are also 2 slides of references that all 3 of us have included in our presentations. And I will turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Hayes.
Thank you very much, all 3 of you. It's just been wonderful listening to you. I had had the opportunity to see the slides beforehand, but hearing the richness of what you have to say makes it even more meaningful. And actually that ties into a question that somebody had asked. The slides are going to be available, I think tomorrow. Each registrant will get a link to the recording. And then I believe that we're going to make the slides themselves available at the divisional website. We have just a few minutes, so I'm going to go slightly over. So many different things to ask and talk about. I loved it that we went from a pretty theoretical down to a very specific level. At the sort of theoretical piece, Sari's K.E.Y.S, I thought, really just highlighted and created a new framework for thinking about performance practice. And wanted to add a piece that I think speaks to the way in which performance psychology these days is just such a burgeoning field. The one real questionnaire that I think we've had available has been one that Taylor and Schneider wrote some 20 years ago. And actually in the latest issue of Professional Psychology Research and Practice, Aoyagi and some of his colleagues have come up with a new set of questions. So Sari can add to her list as well. Wanted to also speak to Charlie's, his wonderful explanation of top-down and bottom-up, and just add that Danny Kahneman's work on thinking fast and slow is a more theoretical framing. Goleman actually is not only a scientist, he's also a psychologist. Just wanted to put a plug in for that. Okay, there was a question actually from somebody to Charlie that asks about the neurological overview. If a client says, how long will it take me to move from top-down processes to more automated bottom-up responses? Okay, you've got somebody who's made the initial buy-in, but how can you and where do you point out the kind of progress and change that they're making?
I would probably say something like, how long did it take you to ride a bicycle, learn to ride a bicycle? And the actual time that it takes will depend upon how much you practice it and how effectively you can become clear as to the difference between the top-down and bottom-up process.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, Gloria, a couple of pieces that I was thinking about. Really liked your description of vulnerabilities and assets for warfighters, and I was thinking that that is a kind of a framework and a model that maybe we can all use with any of our performance populations, and thinking about it broadly, and then, of course, narrowing it down to the individual. Gloria, you also mentioned that that some of what we know from sports psychology doesn't actually translate directly to other populations. And I thought that was just a fascinating point, and wanted to see if people had any particular examples, Gloria or any of the other panelists, of something that you know really well in sports psychology, but it doesn't quite work in another population.
I mean, I think the main, okay.
So the example that comes to my mind is diaphragmatic breathing and working with dancers who are not going to be willing to expand their belly, and really then can profit from understanding that the diaphragm goes around the entire body, so that you can help them learn how to do side breathing or back breathing. You had, Gloria, you had a thought too?
Yeah, I think my the comment I was going to make is more general, that I guess the stress and the consequences, the potential consequences of not performing well for a warfighter are much different than that of an athlete. And so understanding, as I mentioned in the presentation, understanding some of their spiritual orientations and figuring out what drives them and how to keep them connected to their sense of meaning and purpose is a really important piece, that we can't just think about the discrete performance context, that we need to consider sort of the larger person and some of the ways in which they are able to manage that very, very high level of stress when they're in certain situations that mean life or death, either for themselves or for their peers. Or have larger consequences attached to them.
I would agree. I think the domain-specific information that we talk about with our clients really leads us to that specific application that I was talking about, because the stress involved in being a first responder, the culture, the context, the performance stress, the expectations of being a first responder or being a person of the military, of course, is going to be very different from that of a dancer. And so when we conceptualize effectively, I think that really helps us to tailor that specific information and make sure that we're heading in an effective track.
And I guess I would add in, just echo that. There are a lot of athletes who use self-talk when they're thinking about performance to say, oh, well, it's not a matter of life and death. Well, in the military and in medicine, it is a matter of life and death. And so there will be different cognitive interventions for that top-down brain when you are anticipating performance, either before or after, and during the moment of performance. That's where also the bottom-up brain, actually those are, I think, are going to be pretty universal, but there may need to be some domain-specific variations, such as diaphragmatic breathing and using different techniques. In many life and death situations, there's a sense of time distortion where time speeds up and you have to intentionally go very, very slow. I don't know that that's the case with most athletes, though.
We're going to need to wrap up really soon. Just one more question that came in. It was addressed to Sari, but I think, again, applies to all of you. You don't need to be a neurosurgeon in order to effectively work as a consultant in that domain. Person comments, in sports psychology, many athletes don't trust you if you don't have experience in their sport. So what do you do in situations where you haven't had that experience, the experience of the performer who you're working with? Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, of course, I want to be able to convey to someone the importance of their concern, and to let them know that what I'm hearing them say is they want to make sure that I understand their key concerns, and that I understand the difficulty they may have in speaking with me as a performance consultant, and to dialogue with them about that, and again, to listen effectively, to question effectively. I always go back to the example of working with eating disorders, which I know is not a performance-related concern, but it's my clinical specialty that I've been working in for 25 years. And although I've never had an eating disorder, I've been able to work effectively. And when I meet with my clients who have queried whether or not I've had an eating disorder because they're concerned I can't understand them, when I have effective conversations with them and convey to them that if I can understand their experience and I combine that with an effective approach, that we really can have success in treatment if they're motivated to do that. And so I just share that as an example of working with athletes and with other performers, that some of those same strategies can be just as effective as well.
Mm-hmm.
I would include being an anthropologist instead of a missionary. An anthropologist goes in really seeking to understand, be a student, as Gloria mentioned. Don't fake it, don't be a missionary, and if there's an area that I don't know, don't, for heaven's sakes, don't try and fake it, because they'll smell it and you'll be totally you'll be ineffective. You've got to be incredibly respectful, like a good anthropologist.
Yeah, and just to add to that,
go for it.
Sorry. To the point about anthropology, one of the things that we do at CHAMP is we do have a medical anthropologist on staff who will go in and embed themselves in the community that we are working with to learn about language, practices, training rituals, and so that we're not going in there presenting some concepts as new and shiny to these folks who probably do this on a day-to-day basis, but we're able to weave in performance psychology concepts to match with their language and their practices. So I know, Charlie, you were using that as an analogy, but that's one of the organizational level things that we're doing to really try to better understand the unique needs of each of the communities that we work with.
Well, that's great. We do have to stop now. I think all of us could go on for another hour or two or more. Thank you all. This has been a very exciting meeting. I think I'm done. I'll turn it back to Ryan.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you to Sari, Charlie, and Gloria for their contributions. It was an amazing webinar. I think I can speak for everyone. And thank you to Kate for facilitating the event. To everyone who attended, the webinar was recorded. We will send out a recording to the listservs and our social media pages in the coming weeks. I'd also like to encourage everyone to join Division 47's Performance Psychology section. This can be found, a link on the right side of our website, but you can also reach out to Sari Shepard if you'd like to be added. Finally, a reminder to submit your abstracts for next year's APA convention in San Francisco, and the deadline for that is December 1st. Thank you to everyone again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.